Great. Welcome to the Leader Talks podcast. My name is Emily Pass. I'm a third-year PhD student at Harvard University, where I study astrophysics, and I'm a Schulich Leader alum from the University of Waterloo, graduating from there in 2019. And so today I'll be talking to Jonah Zankl, who is also a Schulich alum from the University of Calgary. He's now a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, doing his PhD there now, but also having finished a master's degree, where he studies the role of networks in entrepreneurship. So we'll be talking today about entrepreneurship and also a little bit about our shared experiences pursuing grad school internationally. So welcome, Jonah, and welcome everyone who's listening.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily.
All right, to get started, of course, the Schulich Scholarship, one of the big qualities or things that are important in the program is entrepreneurial mindsets. So when you first applied for the Schulich Scholarship, did you already have this interest in entrepreneurship and this vision of where your career would take you?
Yeah, that's a great question to kick things off. I think it's interesting, despite having now studied entrepreneurs for over 4 years between my master's and PhD, I've never really thought of myself as much of an entrepreneur, but I think there's actually a distinction there between this idea of entrepreneurial mindset and entrepreneurship more broadly. And the two definitely go hand in hand. So for myself, I'd never really thought about starting my own business necessarily. My undergrad was in math and economics, and I was really interested in kind of this intersection of math and technology and finance, but not necessarily, how would I turn this into a career as an entrepreneur? But I think looking back at some of the work that I was involved in high school and then throughout my undergrad time as well, a lot of it had to do with projects where I could be creative, perhaps look at emerging technologies, such as some time that I spent with the University of Calgary solar car team, and really using kind of, lots of business skills in, I guess, an entrepreneurial fashion, but I've never really put the two and two together, but was always fascinated by entrepreneurship in general and people who took that on as a career path.
Cool. So you mentioned the solar car team. Are there other opportunities during your undergrad that help shape this direction that you've been on?
Yeah, so I think throughout my undergrad, I always tried to find ways to, apply what I was doing in the classroom and maybe get some real world sense, both having worked as an intern or a summer student and then turning that into a more permanent position before starting my master's. But then also a variety of things I got involved with on campus. So like I said, the solar car team was one, where I managed kind of the business operations for a $500,000 student project, including logistics of traveling internationally and competing in competitions overseas. But then some other work as well around kind of design thinking and how we could encourage students to, envision what possible futures of the Alberta economy would look like through a case competition that I helped develop with a local entrepreneur. Being involved in a few different projects on campus in terms of connecting a program called Scholars Academy at the University of Calgary back out into the local community. So we partnered with the local business improvement district in terms of how they would increase their member engagement, as well as a number of things. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there was always lots of fingers and lots of pots, which I think is quite a common experience that you might be able to relate to as well from your experience as an undergrad.
For sure. And I guess from that perspective of trying to relate to other students who might be interested in those same kind of opportunities, how did you get involved with those projects? Is it something you just reached out to people, or how do those things come to be?
Yeah. So I think on the one hand, part of it was maybe this kind of deliberate search. So I'm maybe going to get a little bit sociological here, and one of the concepts that I've been exploring through my research is around serendipity. And we often think about serendipity as being kind of random chance or fluke luck or dumb luck. But actually, I think serendipity is the combination of two processes. One is this deliberate search. So maybe you have skills in mind that you want to develop. Maybe you are just looking to, build new connections or new friends or a new hobby. And that's kind of that deliberate side. And then there's the luck part, I guess. But I would say it goes hand in hand with some deliberate activity. So the luck part is I was looking for ways to gain some kind of business skills at the beginning of my undergrad, and came across this solar car team project, where they were looking for students to help run the program from an accounting perspective. They were looking for accountants. Me being quite naive, I thought, hey, well, I would like to learn accounting. So what a better way to do this than to join the project as an accountant? And it turned out they were actually looking for people who knew how to do accounting already. So I was turned down from the team in the first instance when I applied, but then got really involved in sponsorship and development work, which was something I had done through some of my community involvement in high school. So there was some luck involved with actually, expanding my range of search into, outside of the original scope at least. And that's where, it's on that one hand being intentional, and then on the other hand being open to opportunities. So I think, if I were to give a piece of advice for students, it's, don't, if at first you don't succeed, try again. Maybe that's the mantra, but that there's always different opportunities out there if you just maybe expand your field of vision a little bit.
Awesome. I guess changing gears a little bit, moving out of your undergrad degree and into grad school, did you know when you were an undergrad that you would want to go to Cambridge, or when did that pop up onto your radar? Was it serendipitous, or was it something that you really strove towards?
Yeah, again, it's maybe serendipity is a common theme in how I've ended up where I am. But I would say it was, again, a little bit of broad luck. So I think I decided pretty late in my undergrad that I would want to keep going and do a master's degree, and really didn't start searching in earnest until probably about, I guess, November of my final year of undergrad. And I was, at that point, I had been working for a few years as a technology manager at a bank while doing my undergrad for a regional bank in Alberta, ATB Financial. And I knew that I just wanted to do more. I wasn't quite done yet. So because I was working at this intersection of kind of technology and banking, I thought, oh, well, there's this innovation aspect to my role, and maybe I'll do a master's in innovation, whatever that might look like. And that's honestly what I Googled. I did a Google search for Masters of Innovation. There was a program at Carleton. That was the first result that came up. And the second result that came up was the program that I applied to at Cambridge, which was for a master's in innovation, strategy, and organization, which turned out not to be quite what I expected the program to be, but actually has led me down the path into pursuing PhD research now. So yeah, it was again a little bit of.
Sorry, how was it different than your expectations?
Yeah, so going in, I think. The programs that I compared, the one in Carleton was very practical. You were learning lots of skills about, how do you implement innovation practices hands-on inside of an organization, versus the program at Cambridge was actually a little bit more of this sociological, philosophical view of what does innovation even mean inside of an organization? What are some of the approaches to how we manage people and technology, such that we can produce innovation in the first place? So it ended up being a lot more sociological, I guess, but has really opened my eyes to understanding that what we learn in an MBA actually has roots in a lot of longstanding sociological research, which is where my interest focus now. So I didn't expect to get kind of this hands-on experience in actually qualitative research, which was very different than my undergrad. And it's worked out for the best. Again, bit of serendipity there.
Awesome. Yeah. Would you say that, I guess, in the interdisciplinary aspect is what has appealed to you, the combining the STEM with more of the sociological focus? Is that something that you think that Schulich leaders can get in their undergraduate degree? Is there ways to seek that out as an undergraduate student, do you think?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I've always been interested in is, there's this concept of kind of like boundary spanning. So how do you sit at this intersection of multiple disciplines? And when we look at kind of careers of the future now, so many roles require us to sit at this intersection of different fields. People that we would have considered to be technologists in the past maybe sit at the future of solving our sustainability crisis, from both understanding the technologies, but also human psychology around how we solve some of those problems. Or if we're going to solve kind of food security or food insecurity, how do we have to understand what are all the cultural determinants around food insecurity, food waste, as well as increasing the efficiency of farming. So I think Schulich leaders can increasingly get that as universities also recognize that these are interdisciplinary problems that require interdisciplinary skills. So from the one side, I think of the programs that I applied to for my undergrad, programs such as the University of Guelph, they let you combine different majors in this like very interdisciplinary program where I think you can take combinations of like 4 or 5 different programs and mesh them together. Or for myself, having done 2 degrees at the same time at the University of Calgary, so I could do economics and math, kind of having the underpinning science, I guess, to the economic side. So I think that Schulich leaders can get that, and part of it is just about even choosing your options wisely. I can remember some of my favorite courses that I took in my undergrad were around like building sciences and how LEED buildings are designed, all the way through to nanoscience and learning about gold ion particles and stuff that we use for drug delivery. So just exposing ourselves to all kinds of different information in our undergrads is one way we can get that, or really structured programs. So I think it's becoming more common.
I definitely agree. I personally did an English minor, and I found that was very valuable. Like when I was first deciding to do it, I thought it was something very different and it wasn't going to be applicable to what I was doing, but it was, something I was interested in. But now in retrospect, I really see how those writing skills and that and analytic skills you develop by critiquing literature applies to STEM in such a complementary way. So yeah, definitely agree with you there. So grad school abroad, we touched on this a little bit, that it was a bit serendipitous that you decided on the program that you did, which happens to be in the UK. But let's talk a little bit more about that transition. How did it feel moving to another country, and is that an experience you'd recommend to Schulich leaders thinking about where they want to go for grad school?
Yes, definitely. That's a great question. I think so for me, even in my undergrad, I always lived close to home or at home. Having grown up just outside of Calgary, it wasn't a far commute to get to the university. So it was a big step to move, to the opposite side of the world, let alone opposite side of the country, which some Schulich leaders will have already experienced. So I think for me, it was both a big adjustment, but it also, I think, allowed me to really immerse myself into my master's in particular, and then now throughout my PhD as well. And, I think the adjustments are big and small. The academic system looks different, particularly at a place like Cambridge. There's lots of nuance and 850 years of history, which makes things at times incredibly exciting, and at other times incredibly frustrating. But then even just down to the nuance of, how is everyday life going to look like? I mean, everybody knows that people joke about how small everything is in the UK, and that's definitely true. I can remember the bedroom I had last year. I could touch both walls, standing in the middle of the room. So there's all kinds of cultural differences. There's all kinds of scholastic differences or academic differences in the universities. But I think stepping away from home, it helps you reframe a little bit sometimes and really immerse yourself in the experience.
And I guess foreshadowing a bit about, talking about the role of networks in a little bit of a different sense, moving to a new place, you're obviously building a new network and having a new experience that way. What was your experience building a new network in a country that you weren't familiar with? Was it something that was difficult or something that came naturally to you?
Yeah, so I think one of the benefits, being at Cambridge in particular, the way that the school is set up makes it really easy to make those strong connections right from the beginning. So Cambridge has a college system. So we're organized into 32 different colleges, which have, their own dining halls, social space, and kind of academic community involved with them, as well as being part of the business school at Cambridge, which is highly international, with MBA students that they bring in every year. I mean, there's 220 students from, I think, over 100 different countries typically. So it's a really diverse cohort, both within the college and within the business school. And I think, especially master's programs are typically a little bit smaller. You spend a lot of time with those peers, starting to learn, both your subject and kind of the skill of academia, let alone my PhD program, where there's only 5 of us in my cohort for a year. So really, really easy to build these small networks. But then again, this idea of being immersed in a new environment, I got myself really involved into sport, which turned into one of my biggest networks, having competitively rowed here now for 3 years in rowing boats. So, I think it takes effort. Just like starting out our undergrads, I think lots of us forget that first experience of walking into a classroom of 400 people, first year calculus. I can remember that class. The person who I sat down next to on the first day ended up being one of my best friends. Likewise, a number of the people in my college and program that I started to talk to on day one are still really good friends today, despite now starting to scatter back across the world as everybody finishes their PhDs.
Yeah, I definitely had that experience as well. That people that I got to know during orientation week, you end up spending the entire undergrad being friends with. It's those bonds that you make when you're starting at a new place it's a very unique time in your life when starting somewhere new that you can become friends with someone so quickly and develop those deep connections so quickly.
Yeah. And did you find a difference between your time being in Canada and then now being in the US? Like any differences there?
In terms of the social aspect with
the social aspect, getting started, same, difference between your undergrad and PhD now.
I think what you said about cohorting really resonates with my experience. We have a little larger cohorts. There's 11 of us in my program in my year, but that's a lot smaller than in my undergrad class, where there was 100 students in physics in my year. So you really get to know everyone within that little bubble quite closely, and you take all your classes together, and you're going through the same milestones, qualifying exams, things like that. So that kind of fire forge friendships and collaborative like collegial connections are different than an undergrad, where you have a lot of people that you have the opportunity to meet, but there's less of an impetus to get to know everyone that's in your path, because there is a larger group of people, of course.
Yeah.
And also I guess that everyone who is in your cohort has a very similar goal, that they're working on this very specialized problem that you're also working on. And so that's a very unique opportunity that to be surrounded by a group of people who have a very specific but complementary vision to your own.
Yes, for sure. I agree with that.
All right, so I guess we already started to talk a little bit about research. So maybe you can give a little bit more of a deep dive into what exactly it is that you have spent the last few years working on. What does it mean to study networks and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I always try to think of what my elevator pitch is. Because it's, we get asked this question all the time, and of course it's really hard to summarize, long papers into short words. But I think if I were to try to describe maybe what I'm interested in and then conversely what I research, I'm interested broadly in how society affects the way that entrepreneurship is enacted today. So we could translate that into questions like, why do we see the fascination with unicorn companies? That's one of the questions I'm trying to answer right now in one of my papers.
Maybe for the benefit of some of our viewers who might not know what a unicorn company is, you can just briefly define that.
Yes, for sure. So a unicorn company or a unicorn venture is, on the one hand, it's a financial metric. So as new ventures or entrepreneurs start their businesses, they go out and seek funding to support that business. When a company has been valued at over $1 billion through the capital that they've raised or going public on the stock market, they're known as a unicorn. So it's actually quite a recent term. It was a venture capitalist who started using this term in 2013. And of course, it's become widespread now in the media and pop culture. I don't have the book with me, but I have one that's bright yellow, and it's called Trampled by Unicorns. It kind of looks at these unintended consequences that these large, often technology-based businesses have on our society. So that's one of the questions I seek to answer is, why is it that we now take for granted that unicorn companies both do exist and should exist, especially when we look at some of the negative consequences that they have on society. So this is one of the relationships, how does society influence the way startups are created? And then on the flip side, what are some of the unintended consequences of the way that we create startups on society? So these are some of the questions that I'm interested in. On the one hand, kind of conceptually and taking sort of a philosophical approach to this, what does it mean for entrepreneurs to be responsible? Should they be responsible? What should they be responsible for? And then empirically, I've been working with an organization in Cambridge for about 2.5 years now, where they're creating a new set of support systems to help new entrepreneurs in health tech, med tech, and digital health technologies, essentially. So trying to understand how is it that we go about creating these support structures, what's important for entrepreneurs, and equally what's important to help make sure that these ventures are created for the good of society. So that's kind of my research in a nutshell.
Very interesting. And so what do you think personally about ethics and in business? What does it mean for a company to behave ethically? Or because I guess based on what you said, it's kind of taking for granted that maybe unicorns aren't behaving ethically, or at least that seems to be the implication. And so what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I think to me, there's a lot to unpack here potentially. So I'll maybe try to keep it brief, but I think at the end of the day, we're increasingly moving towards a world where consumers, especially people in our generation, care about how products are made, not just from the environmental impact that they have, but also the social impact on the people that businesses employ, whether that's in the country where a company might be headquartered, or equally the treatment of workers often overseas in terms of manufacturing and living conditions and sort of the consequences of what we buy on other people's livelihoods. That's a trend that's increasingly becoming important, and I think is important. And then at the same time, as technology becomes more pervasive, more easily accessible, what does it actually mean for our standard of living to increase? Does it mean that everything necessarily needs to become cheaper, faster, delivered to our door in 30 minutes? Like, what is it that we're trying to create as a society? So to me, I think organizations and especially startups have a responsibility to society to make sure that we're actually improving the quality of life, that we're not unnecessarily lowering standards of living for people either in our communities or abroad, that we are not increasing wealth inequality in our society through startup ventures, which is another unintended consequence, or perhaps intended in some cases, consequence of entrepreneurship today. We only need to look at the largest technology ventures in the world to see that maybe something's not going quite right, whether that's the erosion of workers' rights through Uber, whether that's the displacement of people from their homes and being able to afford rent through the proliferation of Airbnb, or the unintended consequences of free shipping and delivery on the environment. Are these all things that actually matter in our world? And I think that we have a lot of work to do to step up the responsibility of businesses in solving that.
Can you give us a little taste of what your research methods look like? Like, how do you go about investigating these kind of questions in your day-to-day research work?
Yes. So this question of kind of like responsible entrepreneurship is a piece that we have out at a journal right now, based purely on conceptual and kind of theorizing work. So what that means is a day like today, I spent a lot of the day reading various pieces of literature, ranging on topics, everything from the sociology of propaganda, all the way through to kind of the sociology of unintended consequences and what that means. And we try to theorize, what is it about the way that the world works, or the way that we understand how people make sense of the world around them, to argue how responsible entrepreneurship has become justifiable. So I look at kind of longstanding literature on ideology and like I said, kind of these conceptions of disruption that have existed since the early 1900s through to today. So that's very philosophical, kind of academic work, so to say. But then the majority of my research is qualitative. So what that means is this organization that I've been working with. I spend a lot of time observing meetings. I read a lot of email interactions and spend a lot of time talking and interviewing the people who work inside this organization to understand how do they make sense of the work they're trying to do. What are the practices they're involved in terms of creating networks, bringing in resources from government providers or private providers to build kind of this digital platform they're working on to connect entrepreneurs with different support systems in the local ecosystem. And just really trying to understand, how does this process work? So this is kind of where my research boils down to, is understanding the processes behind these phenomenon. So yeah, lots of time talking.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And do you think, or in your opinion, how has the pandemic affected these type of networks, or the way that people feel about culture? I know that obviously the pandemic has had a big impact on remote work and how we think about work. And is that something that you see in the qualitative analysis that you do?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I think it's difficult to see the counterfactual. That's been an unfortunate consequence of doing a PhD, having started in 2019 into 2020, is not being able to observe a lot of how this work happened beforehand. So I think on the one hand, these virtual connections have opened up a lot of doors. There's less boundaries than there used to be, particularly in terms of geography. So we're seeing networks evolve in terms of how entrepreneurship is enacted, that the global has become very local, because it's very easy to have this conversation like we are today from opposite sides of the world.
One Cambridge to another Cambridge, yeah.
Exactly, it's the meeting of the Cambridges today. So I think that's one really positive effect. On the other hand, entrepreneurship is really a relationship-based endeavor. We think it's about the best idea or the smartest technology or the most funding that can be raised. But at the end of the day, successful entrepreneurial ventures are the ones who can build the right connections at the right time. And often that's serendipity involved again. They're out looking for somebody who might have a range of expertise in a particular subject area, or they might be looking for a mentor who can help support them at a particular stage of their business. But if you don't know who to turn to, scrolling through a list of people online might not get you very far. Building a connection over Zoom is really difficult, especially in something that is, a little bit nebulous. The idea might be quite early stage. You're not quite sure what you need. You're not quite sure who to turn to. And that can be really hard to overcome in a digital sense. But it opens up a global network again. So how do those two things balance? It's hard to say. I think there's pros and cons to where we're at now in the world, hopefully, where, it seems like digital is probably here to stay in some sense, but we're back out networking in our own communities as well. And I think we can turn to our own experiences as PhD students. I know you mentioned you were just at a conference not too long ago or preparing to go to a conference. These are, things we would have had the experience to do earlier in our PhDs, and we're now trying to catch up on. We don't have those same networks. We haven't learned those soft skills along the way, and entrepreneurs are facing the same challenge, I think.
And do you see that difference between the UK and Canada, or in this kind of digital age where there's less boundaries, do you find that the UK experience and the Canadian experience has become more homogenous, and that there isn't these, I guess, local scale differences, that the entrepreneurship culture between the countries has become more similar? Or do you think that they're still very distinct and have their own different experiences and nuances?
Yeah, so I think it probably depends on where in the entrepreneurship process we're looking. So there's some nuance in terms of, early stage entrepreneurship is really about, kind of either seeking out or generating ideas for building new businesses. And I think that's where a lot of this online early stage facilitation can actually have a lot of benefit. And that's probably quite similar across, most contexts, whether that's Canada and the UK or elsewhere for that matter. How do we have lots of light touch conversations, generating ideas, getting feedback, getting some insight from different sectors, that sort of thing. Probably later stage, there's some differences in terms of appetite towards risk. There's actually lots of cultural studies around, perhaps not too surprisingly, but Americans are often more risk loving or less risk averse than their counterparts either in Canada or the UK. And that plays out in terms of how later stage, larger startups often seek funding, or the amount of funding they can even receive, because there's just a little bit of risk aversion in Canada and the UK in particular compared to the US. But now that everything or lots of things are virtual, if you're looking for venture capital money, perhaps those networks, which used to be really, really regionally bounded, we heard about all kinds of startups moving into Silicon Valley to get funding, don't necessarily have to do that anymore, because we've built kind of these digital bridges. So that's maybe where some of this is starting to evolve, is not necessarily entrepreneurs themselves who might have already been looking globally, but actually the rest of the support network also starting to expand outside of their next door neighbors, essentially.
So if you were talking to a Schulich leader back home in Calgary who had a startup idea and wanted to move forward with this idea, would you recommend to them to take it to Silicon Valley, or do you think that they could find success in Canada in these smaller markets?
Yeah, so I think increasingly there's this push by policymakers and governments, and universities really are some of the backbones of these initiatives to build these strong entrepreneurial ecosystems in many communities, whether that's looking at Cambridge having one of the strongest entrepreneurial ecosystems in Europe, or looking at Calgary, Kitchener-Waterloo, or Cambridge, Massachusetts. All are building these really strong hubs of support for entrepreneurship. So I would say, especially at the early stage, there's no need to move. There's lots of resources and lots of new organizations being built every single day across the country in Canada to support entrepreneurs. And policy measures that help support that in terms of tax incentives and research grants and a whole gamut of options to really stay close to home and build Canadian technology. So going back to our conversation about unicorns earlier, there's a number of unicorns that are headquartered in Calgary or Vancouver, or take your pick of any Canadian city, where they've stayed in Canada and have built really strong, often again technology-based businesses in these different Canadian cities.
Is that something, would you want to go back to Canada once you finish your PhD, or do you think that the UK network that you're developing is something you want to stay in?
Yeah, so I think for me, I'm not quite done exploring yet. I think the last few years, of course, has taken all of us to a point of wanting to travel more and see more and do more. Despite now living in the UK for nearly 4 years, I've only been to Europe twice in that time. So yeah, I think I'll be over here for a while longer yet.
And you said that you don't consider yourself an entrepreneur, more of a support for entrepreneurs. Is
Mhm.
more direct entrepreneurship something you're interested in exploring in the future, or are you quite content with in the support role?
Yeah, it's I think something that, again, going back to the serendipity kind of aspect, you use the right trigger word today. That, you know, it's, if there's the right opportunity, I think I would probably be interested. I know I've talked to some friends who have built technology or are building technology out of their PhD around, you know, the future of batteries, through to solving issues, some other work around like water and water access, through some AI that they've developed in their PhDs. And, you know, there's always conversations going on. I'm always scanning for what the next thing might be, to help complement kind of, you know, continuing to do research in my field, and then also perhaps getting involved more directly in entrepreneurship.
And do you have any advice for Schulich leaders who are interested in entrepreneurship, either directly in entrepreneurship or a path like yours, where you're focused on the research of entrepreneurship?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think the advice that I would give is, there's this great paper, and of course you always remember paper titles that stand out when we were reading tons of them a day. And the paper title is something along the lines of like, unicorn, gazelles, and other mythical animals that get in the way of understanding real entrepreneurship. And what I take away from that is, you know, we've conflated the idea of being highly disruptive, attracting lots of venture capital funding, attracting lots of media buzz, and being really disruptive, with actually creating value in society. So I think at the end of the day, where I think Schulich leaders who are interested in either supporting entrepreneurs or being an entrepreneur themselves can ask the right question is, what kind of value are they delivering to society, whether that's through their business or through the businesses that they're supporting? And, you know, it goes back to my kind of question about, you know, what I'm interested in my research, which is, you know, how can entrepreneurship have a positive effect on society? Are we creating value that means communities are better off, individuals are better off broadly, not the concentration of wealth into one person's pockets? You know, and is society better off through products and innovations and technology that they're creating? And if it's a no to one of those three things, it's probably worth a question of, well, how might we? You know, if it's not, we're not doing it right now, well, how might we in the future? How might we improve society? Or how can we help reorient businesses towards being responsible, towards creating value more broadly? So that would be my piece of advice. Maybe more practically is, you know, just get involved early. Whether that's through business plan competitions at the campus that you're at, or joining, you know, these incubator or accelerator programs that often take place for students, even with very early stage ideas. Never quite sure who you're going to meet, the type of support you might get along the way, and when a bit of luck might intervene to help connect you to the right person at the right time to actually transform that into a real business.
You mentioned a little while back the idea of like media buzz, and one thing that in this entire conversation kind of has been in the back of my mind is those, there's been a lot of like Netflix shows and things like that recently about failed startups, or about, you know, the implosion of startups, like the company with the blood testing fraud that has a new, I think, Netflix show, and We Crashed, about the WeWork implosion. Do you think that this media buzz around these kind of negative sides of startups is reflecting a pushback against that culture of that you're mentioning of startups that are focused on wealth versus the greater good of society, or where do you think that cultural fixation on these kind of stories is coming from?
Yeah, so I think whether it's a case of Theranos or whether it's a case of WeWork, they both illustrate something that's probably a little bit wrong in our entrepreneurship process. On the one hand, could probably look at as Theranos as just a failure of oversight. or perhaps falling victim to hype. So the idea of Theranos, for those who might not be as familiar, is they wanted to revolutionize blood testing, that rather than having to draw vials of blood every time you need to do routine testing for various mineral levels or hormone levels or other standard tests that they might do at a doctor's office, you could do it with just one drop. That was their tagline, which is, that's really reformative, really promising. And the idea that these machines could be in, a supermarket or equally in your doctor's office rather than lab results having to be sent off somewhere else. Like on paper, it's a great idea. And then you look at the glitzy, glamorous board of directors that they had, including like 5-star generals and people who were really involved in policy and these other aspects of public life. And you go, wow, like they've assembled a great idea that could be transformational on the lives of people, reduce cost and access, especially in the US where blood testing is quite expensive. It's all about creating value. It's actually a great idea. So what went wrong? Well, part of it is that we don't know how to regulate or often can't keep pace with technological change in terms of governance and oversight. And people are often willing to invest a lot of money into the promise of reform. This is a great idea. And when you have those high expectations, high hope, low governance, and high injections of capital, like, of course, people are fascinated when it all goes wrong. But I think it stands as an edge case. We could call it either, that they were being irresponsible or just took things too far. Maybe it was actually to be quite deceitful and quite deceptive from the very beginning. Was it fraud, or was it somebody who just didn't know what they were doing? That's a question that, is still being resolved in court. Or WeWork, where, again, there's all kinds of different scenarios, different circumstances that played into that. A large venture capital investor called SoftBank, who invests in, a number of the companies that we're familiar with, like Uber and Airbnb, where they're also looking for the next best thing and how to return large-scale financial returns to their investors. You give one guy large control over vast sums of money, and there's not the right governance in place to make sure things don't go wrong. So I think our fascination with these stories is they capture our attention to go, well, how didn't they see this coming? That's the question I always ask is, you concentrate power into the hands of very few people and lots of money and not much oversight. It's almost not surprising. We should have known better.
And do you think these stories will change regulations or that type of oversight? I know in astronomy, one of the big topics that comes up when we talk about this subject is those satellite networks that all the billionaires are putting up, and it disrupts obviously observations of the sky, and it creates all the space debris, and they'll collide with each other since they don't properly regulate, who's putting up what. And so, that kind of regulation having these unintended effects on different industries. Do you think that that's something that's going to change with these stories and this media attention, or do you think we're going to keep repeating those same mistakes?
Yeah, I think going back to this paper that I mentioned around, unicorns and other things getting in the way of understanding real entrepreneurship is, these are really the outliers. The number of unicorn companies across the world is, it numbers in the hundreds. The number of large-scale firms like this that get things really wrong, Theranos, WeWork, there's scandal around Facebook and Airbnb for various reasons as well, Uber, take your pick. But these are still a really small subset of, the real business and the real entrepreneurship that's taking place elsewhere. So I almost like to think about it, unicorns aren't necessarily real. Maybe they are somewhere in the world, haven't seen one. But these businesses also don't represent kind of the true impact of entrepreneurship and business on our everyday life. I think they're outliers. We'll probably see cases like this in the future, but I think increasingly investors are becoming skeptical of these, promises of exponential returns in a short amount of time. People are becoming hesitant to invest in businesses that don't have kind of responsibility baked into their core. I think we should see less of this over time, or maybe because we're seeing less of it, it's just happening at a smaller scale, but more often. Maybe that's the unintended consequence of them not being as big of failures in a sense. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
So do you think that policy intervention is necessary, or you think that the market kind of self-regulates in terms of investors not wanting to invest in these more negative ventures?
Yeah, so I would say, and this is the crux of the paper that I'm writing right now, is really we need more of these kind of societal guardrails in place that both help to mitigate these, but also prevent some of it in the first place. So how do we put in policy that helps orient investors towards the long term rather than the short term? Some of that is actually just changing the ways that the venture capital market works. Some of the, who can be involved, what are the exit conditions, what kind of conditions can they impose on entrepreneurs? Some of it might be around actually introducing different models of innovation. So there's lots of research on responsible innovation, which has underlying cores of, how do you have kind of broader society participate in the design? How do you have these regular checkpoints as to what kind of consequences is your technology actually having? When we talk about AI, how do you open up these black box algorithms, make sure we're not introducing unintended bias or perpetuating some of the longstanding inequality in society? I don't think we can leave it fully to the market. It's always a difficult question to answer. It's an ideological question, which makes it even harder to unpack. Because we're at where we are today in society because of a longstanding tradition of government support of innovation in different ways, both through often less regulation, but also increased investment. We wouldn't be talking on iPads or through Zoom if it wasn't for government investment in lots of this technology in the 70s and 80s. And at the same time, we have massive problems with climate, et cetera, because of the non-intervention in some of our innovation activity. So I think there's a balance, but I'm typically more in the favor of us needing some extra help to make sure entrepreneurs are being responsible.
If you could snap your fingers and have one policy intervention in place, what would you pick? What would you think would have the biggest impact in creating this sustainable and more responsible entrepreneurship culture?
Oh my goodness, that is very difficult to answer. So I think there's a framework that I really appreciate that's been put forward by a venture capital company or organization here in the UK, and they call it a conscious scaling framework. And it's an exercise that they go through with the companies that they invest in at the very earliest stage to think of, what are some of the unintended consequences that can arise if we move in particular trajectories through this business. It's a series of questions that they've made open source that they believe all venture capital organizations should be asking the companies they invest in. Whether that's a policy intervention or not, maybe it's a regulatory mandate when you file to get a new business license and you think about, what effect might I have on society, and start to think about, how do we put some of those preventative measures in place to, put in checkpoints that we reflect on. Are we scaling in a sustainable fashion? Are we now creating potentially carbon externalities or societal effects that we didn't anticipate? And then how do we pivot and recalibrate so we're not perpetuating those over time? Maybe that's one way to do it.
Well, thank you for this really insightful view into the world of entrepreneurship. Is there any concluding remarks you'd like to make?
No, I think this has been really good to kind of reflect on both my own experience, and I appreciate you asking insightful questions. I would just encourage anyone in the Schulich Leader network, if you're thinking about entrepreneurship, if you're thinking about grad school abroad, we've got a powerful network here. Just reaching out to other Schulich leaders, whether that's Emily or myself, or anybody else in the network, to think about, what might the next steps look like? Or I've got a question about a technology, specific area. We've got experts in a whole range of fields as the program grows and grows. Your co-founder might be the next person on the list when you scroll through the list of alumni or leaders who just joined the program this year. So, let's harness the network for some entrepreneurial good.